My name is Michał Stęchły, and this is Noisy Intermediate Scale Podcast, a podcast where we'll have in-depth discussions about quantum computing industry, community, and research. Hello. In this episode, I talk with Kanav Setia, who is CEO of qBraid, a startup building tools for quantum software development. We talked about challenges in software and education for quantum computing, Q2B 2021 conference, and future research directions for variational quantum algorithms. I hope you'll enjoy listening to this conversation. Hello. Today, I'm talking with Kanav Setia. Kanav got his bachelor in aerospace engineering with a minor in astronomy from IIST. He later worked as scientific engineer in semiconductor laboratory in Indian Space Research Organization. Afterwards, he started PhD in physics at Dartmouth College. He graduated last year and now is CEO of a company called qBraid. Also, during his PhD, he was an intern at IBM in New York. Welcome, Kanav.
Thank you for having me, Mikhail.
So I wanted to start from asking you about your history of doing space engineering first and then moving into quantum computing. I'm really curious about the backstory of that.
Yeah, happy to talk about it. I initially wanted to get into physics itself, but through some society pressures and a few other factors which played a role into pushing me into engineering. And so I got into an engineering college and there was a debate around whether I should pursue physics, and everyone I spoke with, they just mentioned that, hey, if you're going into physics, you're eventually going to end up in teaching, and that's not a very high paying job, not a very secure future. So you should consider engineering. And that's one of the biggest reasons I got into engineering. So I got into this college called Indian Institute of Space Science and Technology. I had full scholarship and they offered only 3 streams: aerospace engineering, avionics, and physical sciences. And it was a college by Indian Space Research Organization, which is an agency similar to NASA here in the US. And so they wanted to make a college just for their human resource needs. And so that's where I studied aerospace engineering. And after I graduated, I got into semiconductor industry, which was again a unit by Indian Space Research Organization. So I completed my bachelor's, got into there, and that's where I realized I still wanted to do physics, because there was one thing I realized that if I didn't do, I would really regret it. So I just went for it, got into PhD program at Dartmouth, and here I am.
That's pretty cool. You've been doing in your life both space engineering and quantum computing, which is pretty crazy.
Overall, I'm quite thankful for how it turned out. If I had gone straight into physics, I think the number of experiences that I got to have wouldn't have been as exciting. So I'm kind of really thankful for the trajectory I ended up taking.
That's great. And actually, that's an experience from your years of doing aerospace engineering is actually useful directly in anything you're doing today, or more indirectly?
I would say more indirectly. Everything you do kind of shapes your worldview, right? So in that sense, I think I have very different worldview compared to many theoreticians or people who've just done, let's say, a PhD in physics through one track. Like they went into bachelor's of physics, then maybe master's in physics, eventually PhD, or bachelor's in physics and eventually a PhD in physics. So compared to that, I feel like I bring in a different perspective. Like the way I think about problems is very different. And yeah, I think in that regard, it helps the way I think about problems. But directly, it hasn't helped me a lot in my work.
I see. Okay, now let's get to my standard question, which is, what are you currently working on, and why do you think it's important?
That's a great question. Currently, I'm working on building qBraid, and as Mikhail, you already probably know, what we are doing is building one-stop platform for accessing different quantum software as well as hardware. And why I believe this is important is because this was one of the major problems that I faced even in my PhD, where I was spending a lot of time debugging classical software or dealing with Pythonic issues. And that's where I realized like I could save this much time for every PhD student or every researcher. And that was the motivation. I wanted to save a lot of time for researchers and time tests moving forward. And this is where if I can do that, where I can increase the efficiency or automate a bunch of stuff for really incredibly smart people, then I think that would be a very big achievement for myself.
So how are you trying to do that at qBraid? What is this platform, this environment, what it is about, and how does it help people?
Yeah, sure. With qBraid, if you're familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, then when you log in, we provide you a Jupyter Lab environment where most of the software is already pre-installed, like Qiskit, Cirq, AWS Brocket, Rigetti's Pikewell, Xanadu's PennyLane. All of these come pre-installed, and now we're also working on qBraid SDK, which helps you transpile circuits between these libraries and also provides you access to hardware. So essentially, you would never have to do a setup on your local machine. The compute will be configurable, which means, let's say you want to run big simulations, you'll be able to swap out 4 virtual CPUs for 40 virtual CPUs, and you'll be able to run like giant tasks and access quantum hardware from a single location.
Cool. I mean, it sounds like helpful tool for researchers, and it's also like somewhat similar to what we're doing at Zapata. So yeah, we definitely also recognize this issue.
Yeah.
And how did you came up with this idea? And you were, I guess, you were doing PhD. You were facing many of these issues, but why did you decide that? Well, actually, creating such solution is a good business idea.
Yeah, I think the motivation was purely from, like, if you are working in this area, you know these software packages come up with updates very often. And there were a couple of projects where I was working on, and a few updates in Qiskit happened, and suddenly the whole code base that I had was just breaking. And I was like, okay, there needs to be a better way of doing this. And there's a chance that if the field grows exponentially in the coming years, people will definitely pay for a better experience. And that was sort of the bet I was trying to make, where if the field is growing exponentially, everybody will be interested in using a platform which is more stable and more robust, and where they don't have to do a lot of these things and they could focus on the quantum part.
Sure, but if you provide a platform where, like an environment with all the versions of those libraries pre-installed, someone writes their code in Qiskit version 27, then, well, Qiskit finally will update to version 28, so their code will break. So how does it actually protect them? Is it just like that, the versions don't update automatically so that you hope like it won't break, or how does it work?
Yeah, so what we're planning to do, part of it is already working. We've created like a GUI for Python environments.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is we never update Python environments. So if there's a Qiskit version with 27 and everything else is installed, now that's like a Python folder which just sits there for eternity.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime Qiskit comes out with a new update, we'll just make a new environment. So that means whenever you're ready to use this new environment, it'll be there for you, but at least we're not pushing it on you to move to a new environment or new version. And the other important thing is this could be achieved with requirements.txt, as you probably already know. But even that had a lot of problems. Like there's Python has this weird issue with versions and dependencies, where even if your requirements.txt goes through for the first time, there's no guarantee that the same requirements.txt would work 6 months later.
Do you mean like transient dependencies and things like this? So like the dependencies of my dependencies, right?
Yeah.
So that basically so for example, the issue is that even though I said that my Qiskit, I pinned Qiskit version to, I don't know, like 0.27, Qiskit requires NumPy, but the dependency of NumPy in Qiskit is NumPy bigger than 1.5, right? So today it might install the newest version with, I don't know, like 1.6, but 6 months from now, maybe NumPy might be updated to 1.7, and then actually I don't have the exact same dependencies, right? I have some others. Is that something that you are trying to solve, or actually something different?
That is exactly the issue I was talking about, and it's not just the Qiskit. Like when you install other packages, some of those could have, for example, NumPy greater than 1.5. Others could have NumPy less than 2, and one of those weird ones will have a pinned package. And so if you give it 6 months, because there's like flexibility in how you specify requirements, if you give it 6 months, the same requirements.txt is almost guaranteed to break, right? So the best version the best way is to just like have install using requirements.txt and keep that environment frozen. Never touch it.
Yes.
Right? Because if that's there, whatever files you have in there is just there. You can't mess with it. So that's our plan for solving environments where if that package just sits there and is always available, you are guaranteed that your code will work.
Yeah. Yeah, this is definitely something we struggle a lot with at Zapata. And like just there's constantly like some updates somewhere which breaks things, and we control that to some degree, but sometimes there are just things that you didn't think could happen. It's just like are hard to predict. So just like keeping the very very strict versions is, I think in like today's very fast moving times of quantum computing, it's like the way to go. So that's like one problem. So the problem of dependencies and like managing dependencies for quantum computing. And I'm wondering, what do you think are some other problems that are hindering students and researchers in quantum computing, that are making this field harder to get into, that are just like wasting enormous amount of time of like all the people involved?
That's a great question. I think in general the field is hard. I mean, we are at a point where at least the interest is getting the field is getting a lot of interest, but it's just in order to do something meaningful, it requires one to spend like a couple of years, right? And we are not at a point where we could have engineers calling some APIs and running problems, right? So these are some fundamental problems which require just time and patience. The other aspect, I think, is just something that exists in a lot of other fields as well, where there's no single place where you can come and quickly check what's going on in the field. So this is another problem we're trying to address is, let's say a new really cool paper comes out and they've done some benchmarking.
Yeah.
Can I test the same code on the quantum computer they tested out in under a day? And this is something that happens all the time for classical computers, where new computers come out and the benchmarks are the same and you can run it really quickly. But the same doesn't exist for quantum computers. So we want to provide users an experience where they log in, and if the code is available for the benchmarking study or a new study for research study on a given experiment, then they'll be able to run on the same quantum computer using the same code in under a day. So that's our internal benchmark, where you should be able to log in and see, oh, that's a really cool piece of code and really cool piece of study. I want to run it for myself. And we don't want you wasting so much time installing and setting up your environment. It's like the tokens are set up, the access for the hardware is set up, the code, you should be able to pull it straight from GitHub. We're working on something where if you have a repository on GitHub, you'll have launch in qBraid button. So you click on that, it opens up an environment, it opens up qBraid, and the notebooks are set, Git repository is already pre-cloned, and you're ready to go.
And actually, you said if there is a paper and there is open source code attached to the paper, which is, from my experience, pretty big if. So actually, what's your experience with that? Because like I won't say I'm like tracking all the open source research associated with papers very closely, but from what I noticed is that sometimes people just don't pay that much attention to actually making sure they pinned the versions and they have this like requirement.txt file in their code associated with research, or simply they added some code and like it is what it is. It's like sometimes that doesn't fully work. So I'm curious whether you have some other experiences maybe, or comment on that?
Not really. I think from personal experiences, PhDs are pretty terrible at writing good code. And that's just like me speaking from my personal experience when I was a PhD student, where like you just want to go through and complete the research, and then after the paper is out, the motivation to like polish the code and put it in a shape where other people could use it was pretty low, because as soon as the paper is out, you want to move on to the next piece of research and work on your next paper rather than cleaning up the code. So yes. I think this is where, if the research is good, I would assume that if other people reached out to the authors, then the motivation goes up. Like I remember my first paper on BKSF, I wrote the entire code base in MATLAB, and I think this is your expression. That was priceless.
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, so I wrote the entire code base in MATLAB, and I put it somewhere in the paper saying, hey, this is all in MATLAB, but I didn't publicly share the code on GitHub or anything. I think 2 years later, after the paper, people from MathWorks, creator of MATLAB, they were reading the paper.
Oh.
And they were like, oh, wait, it says it's MATLAB. And so they reached out and they were like, hey, can you please share the code with us? We were starting to look into quantum computing ourselves as well as quantum chemistry, and this will be so useful. And so that was the time when I went back, found my code, and then put it on GitHub. And that was like an exciting moment because coming back to aerospace engineering, I did most of my work in MATLAB, where I did like 2 really amazing projects, and all of the code was written in MATLAB. So having MathWorks, at one point I also applied for a job at MathWorks.
Oh.
And so that company was like so close to my heart, and having them reach out to me and be like, hey, can we use your code? I was like, oh, okay, I'll put it in a shape where this could be used.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I think, so bottom line, if you find some piece of research that is good, I would assume that authors would respond, and it just takes time. Like, for example, even AI or machine learning, it's just getting to a stage where people are paying more and more attention to code and not just research. And similarly, I expect to happen the same for quantum computing. As fields more towards application focused, people will start paying more attention to having robust code base and making sure it's available for everyone to use.
Yeah. Well, definitely from my experience, reaching out to the authors of the papers is just very good experience. I mean, either they just don't respond because they lost your email or something, or just missed that. Like that's like fine. People are busy; they have like full mailboxes, or they actually share a lot of details and help you a lot to understand what's going on. And I in particular, when I was implementing variational quantum factoring paper by Eric Anschwitz and other people who, like, he was intern at Zapata then, and I wasn't working at Zapata yet. And I sent him an email with a bunch of questions, and really there were like some shortcuts they did in the paper that, well, I assumed they made certain shortcuts, but I didn't know for sure, and I was pretty confused because when it comes to explaining idea, that was okay, but when it comes to like coding this app, it was like, oh, I actually don't know whether I should do A or B, because they are both plausible, and like from scientific perspective they're the same, but like from the code perspective they're slightly different. And it was, I got all the answers, and it was way easier to just go forward with the project. So I definitely like reaching out to the authors. But this is also a good point, that this is giving signal to the authors of the research that people are interested in their work, so maybe making this work open source is a good idea. That's a nice perspective.
Yeah, I think I always loved when people reached out, and anytime anybody reached out to me with questions, I definitely responded. I mean, as a PhD student, there's not much going on in your world, so having people read your papers and reach out to you, I think I'm sure all the graduate students appreciate that, and they're happy to answer questions.
Yeah, but also I talked at Q2B with someone from some national labs, and they told me that one of the problems they have is that, well, they do exactly the same thing, which is they do research project, they have some code, they write a paper, and then they do the next research project. And 6 months later, it turns out they would like to reuse the code they written 6 months before, but that's not possible because the code already doesn't work, or they just didn't know that someone else has implemented this specific method, so they just keep rewriting the same code over and over. So yeah, that's a common problem. Okay, so getting back to problems with maybe not the problems, barriers to get into quantum computing, or some issues people face when learning quantum, but also teaching quantum. I was curious if you could change just like one thing in how people usually explain quantum computing or talk about it, what would that be? Is there, just like one particular thing that like always annoys you, or there's this one particular improvement that you see that like could make it easier for people to get what quantum computing is about?
I think that's a great question, and honestly, I don't have a very good answer. Like I've seen some people do a great job, and some people not so much. I do like the approach that Scott Aronson takes, probability first, and this is something that my advisor James Whitfield also takes, where you want to understand how probabilities are different in the world of quantum computing compared to classical world. And if you could get that part right, then I think it's relatively easy to make sense of a lot of what follows. But ultimately, to start from the fundamentals to go all the way up to applications, I mean, it is a lot of stuff. And there's not just one thing that I could change or anybody could change that would solve the entire process, right? Like you start from just understanding qubits, and then even that requires understanding a lot of quantum mechanics and how things work at that level, and then you have these new phenomenons that we don't have much intuition as humans, like entanglement, superposition, and then you go all the way to using those, building new intuition to building algorithms, which again, even for the classical algorithm where we do have intuition for classical physics, we're not good with coming up with the best algorithms ourselves very easily, right? And so now you're building new intuition, and then you somehow have to come up with new quantum algorithms. I would say one thing that I just thought of one thing. So I think starting early might be super useful. Introducing these new concepts, even in middle school or even in high schools, could be beneficial. So students starting early, getting exposed to these new concepts, I think that could make a lot of the difference.
But for me, one problem with that is that, at least from my experience, when I was at school, I didn't even have proper intro to computer, like classical computer science. And I only in high school, I have just, one extracurricular classes in Python, which that was basically what a for loop is. So if people don't have good idea about what classical computing is, does it make sense to actually teach them what quantum computing is? Or, well, maybe we should actually just attack both things at the same time, because it would be useful for people to actually get some introduction to classical computing concepts. Definitely either way.
That's a great question. I think it could help to introduce both at the same time. It could just be like, hey, this is how classical computers work, and hey, this is how quantum computers work. So a lot of the weirdness that is associated with quantum just comes from the fact that that's new to people and that gets introduced much later, right? If people are learning it in the middle school, they'll be like, okay, yeah, that's what's new. I mean, we knew, right? It's mostly like, if you learn something, it's just, if you showed an iPhone to someone who traveled to future from, let's say, 1980s or 90s, they'll be like, wow, this is so cool, and this is like, how does this even work? And then kids these days who are already using Instagram and Facebook everything else, they're like, yeah,
Whatever.
that's weird, whatever, right? So a lot of the things we make big issues of superposition, entanglement. These might come naturally to people who are reading these things in the middle school or high school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that just the word quantum, has this property that it just scares people. If I talk to my non-science, non-engineering friends and I just use the word quantum, they're like already, okay, I don't understand what you are talking about. Like, don't even try to explain it to me. Like, that's beyond my reach. So actually introducing that in school, yeah, that sounds good. So are you like, another thing is, are there any educational initiatives in quantum computing, or maybe more broadly in science education, that you are particularly excited about?
We're very excited about the number of boot camps which are starting every year. There's like a lot of new stuff or new organizations starting for quantum computing training and boot camps, and at various levels. We work with many organizations that do trainings for high school students. So that has been very exciting. Another initiative we're part of is called qSTEAM.
Okay.
It is an NSF grant for, I think, around $5 million. And it involves, I think, 66 professors at various universities. And all of them are going to create new content for quantum engineering. So I think this should be really exciting in the coming years. You'll see a lot more courses pop up in the field of quantum sensing, metrology, computing, and many other areas at various universities. Because, yes, the field is getting more interest, but if you look at how many good courses are there at universities across the US or in the world, there are not that many. And I'm really excited about this NSF grant and more courses getting built, and hopefully they'll share it openly with everyone. So in general, there'll be more stuff to learn from for people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That would be great. I definitely from my university, we just had one course in quantum computing, which was like basic, like intro to quantum computing, which was pretty good. But then, like, if anyone wanted to do more, they just had to do research with particular group doing not even either hardcore theoretical quantum computing research, which was way beyond my capabilities at the time, and probably still is, or just joining experimental group doing some optical lattices and things like this. But there was just either intro or going to research, and there was absolutely no middle ground. And I think most people who are working in the field who didn't go through like PhD programs, they just self-taught themselves, all the things they had to learn, because there wasn't that much resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it is like important to recognize the field is early, even compared to like a lot of, even right now, we were still developing. I mean, there's no clear idea what should go in intermediate level courses on quantum computing, right? So professors are still busy with their research, and they're still figuring out as to what might be useful for somebody getting into a PhD program, right? And that's what they may want to teach at in a senior year for an undergraduate, right? So a lot of that stuff is still not clear. And so hopefully that'll change in the coming years.
I would say that some of these topics, more or less around workforce development, was something that I heard a lot about during Q2B, so Quantum to Business conference that was in December. So we are recording on December 22nd, so that was like 2 weeks ago in California, where we actually met in real life for the first time. And that was one of the themes, I would say, of the conference. But I'm curious, what were some other things that you found really interesting at that conference? What were some other main topics that you think people covered?
One thing that was super interesting to me was the amount of business interest the field is starting to get. Mm-hmm. So that's certainly exciting for us as a startup. The second thing that I was happily surprised about was how many people were interested in what we are building. So the premise definitely was for the company that, hey, people will want this and use it, but having it actually play out or people telling us, oh, this is really cool, we could use it. So that was interesting to me. Then a few other interesting things. There's like a clear demarcation of people who know their stuff and then people who are just hyping. So that was very good to see as well. And it's funny, like one important thing, like everyone who knew quantum computing well, they were saying, hey guys, let's make sure that we're not hyping too much. But then what's funny was even people who didn't know quantum very well and were hyping, they still were saying, let's not hype too much. And at the same time, so it's like, hey, we want to be realistic and not hype it up, but let us show you how to solve TSP using a quantum computer.
Oh yeah, that's perfect. So basically what you're saying is that actually the fact that someone is saying, well, I don't want to overhype quantum computing doesn't mean that they actually don't want to overhype quantum computing, right?
Yep. So that was a little bit funny to me.
Oh my. Yeah, that's true. But at least I guess it's something that they are. Like 2 years ago, no one was adding this clause to whatever they were saying. This year they are. Maybe 2 or 3 years from now, they will just not talking about things that are unrealistic at all. That was great.
What were the things that you found interesting?
Oh, for me, I would say, like one thing was how much people were talking about workforce development. I know it's an issue. I know education in quantum computing is problematic, but it was nice to actually see people who are, I would say, like not directly engaged in this type of activities. So just like CEOs of some companies or analysts or people like this to also talk about it. I would say another thing was the general vibe where people are actually like cautiously optimistic, and I would say like pretty much like self-aware in the sense that a lot of companies, a lot of people are well aware of the fact that certain things will just not play out well and their companies might die, or that it might turn out that their particular hardware platform might just not be the one that wins. I guess everyone says that their hardware platform is actually have clear path to scalability and so on, but other platform might have some issues. So maybe like every single person is biased towards whatever they are doing. But at the same time, they're like pretty aware of the fact that it's very very uncertain in the near term future. I think what I kind of felt was that there's no doubt that quantum computing will be a thing 10, 20 years from now. And even though there will be bumps on the road, we're actually driving straight ahead. And it's not that there doesn't seem that there will be any dead ends that will stop the progress. So that was pretty encouraging. Another topic that I wanted to ask you about is research. Recently, you co-authored with several other people really good review paper called The Variational Quantum Eigensolver, a review of methods and best practices. And that was collaboration between multiple institutions and a lot of people. So I read that. I mean, not end to end, because it's pretty long paper. I would say like 145 pages, including references. So it's a lot. But since I was actually writing the blog post about VQE, it was extremely useful to have this kind of reference. And one thing that I'm always wondering when I see those review papers is, how does the process of writing a paper like this look like? And could you share some backstory behind this?
Yeah, sure. First, I'm super glad to hear that you found it useful. I think, so thank you so much. I think a big, here I would say, from my perspective, it seems like a big credit to Jules Tilley, the main author of the paper. He was very proactive, because getting everyone on the same call, discussing and reminding them over and over again about their sections and moving things forward. I think he led the charge on all of that. So he would run. So towards the end, we would have weekly meetings. Like, we would meet every Monday for like half an hour, and he would run the show for like, hey guys, we have this part sorted out. We need help here. So the way I got involved with this, have you heard of this company, Rocco?
Yes.
Leo Vosnik. So Leo was a fellow intern at IBM in 2018. And so at that point, he was starting to think about a company which he co-founded later, and they were going to focus on quantum chemistry. And so I think throughout 2019, I did a couple of calls with team members at Rocco, and then shared my opinions on various things and my expertise. And I think during last year, they really wanted to explore a few of the things that I had worked on. So we had more calls, and then they went into exploring VQE. And during that time, they did a lot of background studies. So through these multiple calls and through looking into where the field is going, they ended up building like a lot of references and a lot of the research that they did. And so eventually it was a matter of, they went like, hey, it seems like we put together a lot of stuff and other people may find it useful. So let's compile this and publish it as a review paper. And so that's where fermionic encoding, you probably already know, makes like a big chunk of VQE or quantum chemistry applications. And so that's where they wanted my help, and they asked me, hey, can you help us make sure that this section is in order and there are no mistakes, and make sure this is robust. So that's where I came in. I looked at that section, and there was another section related to symmetries and reducing the qubit resources, and in general, more comments on what came before on VQE and after. Yeah, but that was the section that I did decent amount of writing for. And
sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so basically, everybody had their own sections, and then towards the last week, everybody just read through the paper and gave comments.
Sure. And for how long you were working on this?
Oh, this, I would say, took like minimum 6 to 8 months. I think 8 months ago was when the idea sort of, I think, came together that maybe they want to write a review paper. But 3 months ago, I think, was when they reached out and they were like, okay, this is getting more serious. We have the draft. Can you help us review this section?
Sure.
And so that's when I actively started contributing.
Mm-hmm. Cool. What is kind of a direction in the research associated with VQE in particular, I guess, that you are particularly excited about?
That's a great question. And I think VQEs in general are very exciting. But overall, I'm excited about the hardware progress, to be honest. VQEs, as you probably already know, there's no guaranteed proof that it will work. And yeah, that's where it gets tricky, where all you need is like a little more robust hardware to try out interesting stuff. So I'm actually more excited about 200 or 300 qubit systems where even the qubits are noisy, but that will give people something to play with. I'm sure there'll be various kinds of ansatz, optimizers, and a lot of other cool stuff, right? So various issues with measurements and ansatz, or which one's the best one, or the error mitigation techniques. Those questions become relatively easy to answer once you have the system, right? It's like it's like machine learning. Once you have GPUs, it's relatively easy. Hey, just run your model and see if it works. See its performance, rather than like theoretically arguing, oh, this may or may not work. So if in the next 2 or 3 years we're going to have 200 to 300 qubits, I'm very excited about that. As in, that'll give us sort of like the GPUs of the quantum world, where we'll just run our models and see if it works or not.
I see. Makes sense.
What are your thoughts on VQE?
So my thoughts on VQE, all right, let's say like maybe variational quantum algorithms, kind of more broadly than just VQE. I mean, I think they're extremely interesting, and I always kind of really liked heuristic algorithms, in the sense like even in the classical algorithms, I just had a lot of interest in them. And the fact that you actually have no guarantees is particularly exciting, because you have no guarantees, but like a lot of them just work. So it's hard to say, why exactly they're so effective or not. I mean, a lot of them just don't work at all. That's also true. But my thoughts are that we will see. And I think what you said about getting better hardware is really important point. That right now, most of the things we see is just done on the simulation, and like we'll actually see how it works on the hardware, and this will probably inspire a lot of new progress. I'm slightly worried about many issues that like measurement problem, right? So basically for VQE, given certain assumptions, it might take you 30 days to just running your quantum computer non-stop to just get one energy evaluation, and you need like thousands of them, which is not very encouraging. And this is definitely a problem that is daunting, but at the same time, like people are working on solving these problems and just like getting better methods. We'll see. I mean, I think that even if these algorithms don't turn out to be very useful in the long term, I think they will just like lead us to some ideas or like some other types of algorithms that will be useful. Hard to say.
I think too, the measurement problem that you mentioned, where it just takes super long. I remember like in my grad school reading this paper by Matthias Troyer and I think Matt Hastings, where they did the initial resource estimation for very small molecules. And they had like ridiculous number of gates in there. And if you look at the trend over the past 8 or 9 years, or actually 10 now, since their original paper. It's consistently come down.
Yes.
So I think again, I have absolutely no proof for this, but my guess is even the resource requirements could be brought down. You just have to extrapolate the trend, and there's no reason for why it should keep going as the resource required should keep coming down. But yeah, it may keep going as well, right? Mm-hmm. So if the resources come down and suddenly, let's say, a factor of 10 improvement brings down the resources dramatically, right?
Yeah.
And there could be a factor of 100 in there as well. And then maybe there's something in the encoding where you don't need, maybe you need more qubits, but the number of measurements come down, right? And if the number of qubits go up, but your algorithm is okay with noisy qubits, then that just changes the game, right? Like, because you can keep scaling up the number of noisy qubits, which doesn't seem to be much of a problem. Just going up consistently in the number of qubits with noise going down, that is where that's a hard problem, right?
Yes.
So if you could just scale up qubits, but then you get to bring down the number of measurements, and your algorithm is okay with noise, then that's fine. Like, give it another 2 years, and you'll have a factor of 100 improvement in the number of qubits, hopefully. Mm-hmm. And then you're looking at something like a matter of hours compared to 39 days.
Yeah. That's true. At the same time, like one of the issues that I see with this field in general, and this is from the perspective of the person that's just like doing a little bit of research on the side. You know, like research is not something I'm like, that is my kind of main responsibility. So I see so many interesting research directions and so many papers coming out constantly, and not even, you know, like bad papers. There's just like too many good papers coming out, and I feel that, you know, no one is able to actually be aware of everything that's going on and just like synthesize all this knowledge. So I think there might be certain methods that should work well together. Like someone has this like better estimation method and someone else has like better ansatz, but you have 20 different estimation methods and like 100 different ansatses, and like the chances that these two someone will take these two and combine them and like, wow, they were really working well together, is just like super small. And I don't see any way of like avoiding this problem, and I guess this is something that's like happening a lot elsewhere as well. But there's just like at some point, you know, someone will connect the, you know, right methods together and then like get huge boost in performance from that. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts around this issue of just like too many research happening, too much research?
I think that's a very interesting point of view. Here we're starting to talk about social dynamics more than the research itself, right? Like,
that's true.
Which is,
that's true.
A fascinating problem, and I think like even if there's a good research, maybe people don't recognize it immediately, but hopefully as the interest in the field grows, there'll be a lot more people coming in. Sure. And at some point you would exhaust, you will be like, okay, at this point we've already explored like 100 optimizers, 100 ansatz. What do we do? And there'll be some weird grad student who'll be like, oh, let me see if I can connect these two things, and then it works better. Yeah. And I think sooner or later, hopefully we will find it, or ultimately the hardware will make enough progress that it wouldn't matter, right? Either way, the problem will be addressed. And I think similar problem, I like to think about it from the social dynamics perspective was, given how much money has flown in to the field,
Yes.
and it's leading to a lot of professors leaving their jobs, a lot of students moving industries, right? When you do that, like, there's inertia to every system. So as people move, they're not going to start churning out good research right away after moving positions. And so what I've been worried about is if the industry would have appetite for waiting a couple of years before they settle down and start producing, right? Let's say somebody left their job at IBM and moved to Amazon, and like, that's a big life change. People move cities and they change research groups. Sometimes they may have to change research directions, and so it could take another 6 months or 1 year before they could settle down and start producing good research. So in the industry, I'm a little bit more worried if they would have time to wait and see good research, right? So this is similar to optimizers and ansatz. If you are willing to wait 4 or 5 years before somebody addresses this problem, right?
Yeah, I guess patience is the key here, because
Yeah.
I would love to see the results tomorrow, but
That's like
yeah. So actually,
patience. Yeah.
patience. Yeah, actually, two things. Like, on one hand, I just realized I said there's like too much research, but actually there's like too little research, and there's like so many questions unanswered, and I would like to see even more research going on, but like then there's like no way any single person could digest that. But the other thing is, I was actually wondering whether because you said people are changing jobs and changing research directions and so on, and I'm curious about you, whether in your current position, do you have really any time for doing any research, or not at all?
Close to not at all.
Okay.
Right now. Like, I expect to change it in the next 6 months. But as of now, there's just so much other stuff related to business, related to classical side of the things, where I don't have much time to look into research. I try to read some papers. Whenever I get a request for reviewing a paper, that's also a very good chance to read the papers as well. So I do that. But other than that, actively doing research is not something that I've been able to do. Another thing that I forgot to mention to your previous questions, right now, whatever we're modeling is related to the the techniques and algorithms we already know, right? There's a good chance that there might be another breakthrough addressing some other problems. So just like with classical computers, as they developed, a lot of the applications that we use them for right now, we didn't envision when they were conceived. So we're also hoping, and I think this was a sentiment shared by Umesh and Scott as well, where they're betting that as the field gets more attention and more really smart people come into the field, we may see some applications of quantum computers that we haven't even envisioned, right? So all of the use cases that we're envisioning are really cool, but there might be some really exciting ones that may end up stealing the spotlight in the long run, waiting for it to be discovered.
But on the other hand, there is this argument that all the algorithms that we got with guarantees are actually have been discovered a long time ago, right? So Grover, Shor, phase estimation, and there has not been that much development of those big algorithms that give you provable speedups in the recent, I don't know, like 10, 20 years. I mean, I'm not keeping up with this type of algorithms that much, but it seems that like we discovered certain archetypes of algorithms at the beginning, and then for the next 20 years, we just didn't discover, like the only big breakthrough, I think, from the algorithmic perspective was like paradigm shift, let's say, was variational algorithms, right? This is like totally new way of doing algorithms. So I've heard this voice, like, don't remember who said that, but like that actually, this might be that there's just phase estimation, Grover, Shor, and those variational that won't necessarily work well in the regime of like millions of qubits, because there will be just like more efficient ways to use that qubits. What do you think about this?
I think that's a valid point. There's two arguments there. One, what is long time? Like 20, 25 years. I think if you're looking for another breakthrough like Shor's algorithm, that kind of stuff could take some time, right? Mm-hmm. The other argument is consistently progress has happened, but they haven't been like a defining moment like Shor's, right? And that could also be related to how people are motivated. Right now, everybody's looking into applications first, mm-hmm. and then algorithms second. So they're interested in understanding applications and what could be addressed rather than... So the motivations are a little bit different. And I don't know, I think I would say more over the past decades, the biggest improvement has happened in the world of experiments. The number of qubits, mm-hmm. for example, have consistently gone up. And another important thing is when Shor's algorithm came out, I don't think it received as much attention as it receives today.
Okay.
Is that fair to say? Right. So maybe some of the papers which seem like, oh, another really cool paper came out, but we wouldn't know their importance mm-hmm. until the next 5 or 10 years have played out, and those few good results from right now have proven to be the ones which drove the next 5 or 10 years, right? Mm-hmm. And then when we look back, we would go, oh, wow, that result from 10 years ago, that was like a game changer, and suddenly it inspired the field, right? It's kind of like we've been in the field, we've known the field, so everything seems incremental, but mm-hmm. there might be something in there that people from 10 years from now would look back and they would go, okay, that was definitely the game changer.
Mm-hmm. But this requires, as we mentioned before, patience to actually see that, like, these particular results get reproduced over and over again. Like more people start seeing that it's useful, and then those like synergies between different methods starts kicking in, and you see that, oh yeah, actually that's good.
Absolutely. For example, like Robert Huang from Presco's group, like mm-hmm. he came out with some really good results from the last 2 years, right? And yeah, those may prove to be like, if somebody figures out how to put those in use and practice, like things may be very different in 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Also, like another thought on that is, so I've recently watched a presentation by Yuval Sanders where he was talking about a lot of different things, among others why papers about quantum algorithms are so wrong. And one of the problems that he mentioned is that we just don't have good building blocks, like well-defined building blocks for this algorithm. So basically every time you write a paper and describe an algorithm, you need to define a bunch of different components of this algorithm, like subroutines or whatever. Well, because just like no one did that before, or it's like it has been done inconsistently, so you just need to be very specific what you mean by certain terms, and which just like slows you down a lot, and like it forces you to write those definitions, make your paper like less legible because there's just like so much stuff in it, instead of focusing on actually what's important. Defining good abstractions in quantum computing is also something that will probably speed up the research and will help us with developing new concepts and algorithms. Because I can't really imagine anyone thinking about neural network architectures we have today while coding was done with punch cards, for example. Like, okay, you could figure out like some graph algorithms, like on a paper, that how they would work, but not really like those complex like neural networks. So I guess it's like we go up in the layers of abstractions. I guess this also might spur some new innovations.
Yeah, that makes sense, but I don't fully understand in what context this is being said. I mean, the part of the reason we don't have very good abstractions is we don't even have hardware yet that would work with those abstractions well, right? Like you have hardware where certain abstractions would work great for certain hardware, but for other hardware, certain other abstractions would work great, right? So,
but we're
not even at a place where we could define a good abstraction.
No. That's the beauty of abstraction. Abstraction is above that. So you have an abstraction of let's say like logical circuit, and then a layer below you have all the fault tolerance that needs to happen to make that happen, and then like below you have the layer of the actual physical circuit that will do all the error correction. So then you can think about this like high level circuit, because you just assume that like other things will be kind of done for you and like different layers, which is totally not doable today because you are like the hardware is not there yet to allow you to do that, right? I mean, you need to care actually about all those little constants and like which qubit you use for this particular algorithm. Like, okay, I can use qubit 8 but not qubit 4 because qubit 4 has like higher error rate or whatever, so you just like fine tune it to the hardware. So effectively you don't have this like separation of those two different layers.
So that's basically the point where like you do have some abstraction, but if you want to use that abstraction right now, you're not going to be able to address any near-term applications.
That's true.
So like right now, for example, you have surface codes and people constantly work on surface codes and improving them, or other error correcting codes and constantly improving them. So as a theorist, essentially, or someone working in algorithm, you could say, I'm just going to start with logical qubit. Well, you can do that, but then you're not going to be able to do any real stuff for the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Patience. Yeah, patience is key.
Beyond that, there's like, if you're throwing away that abstraction, then it becomes like a point where, okay, you're going to have to define new quantum hardware specific abstractions where like they tell you, okay, these are the gates that we can do natively, and you get to work with those. So now that becomes your abstraction, where you don't have to work with the pulses or the pulse control, all those things. Those new gates become your abstraction, where you get to use just those gates and build your algorithm.
But isn't it something they did for the Sycamore? Where they actually built the whole ansatz, like the whole circuit, using the gates that were exactly hardware implemented. So that was exactly what they were using.
That's the point where like you'll have to throw away this logical qubit abstraction away out of the window if you want to do some real world stuff. Right? If you're willing to wait 10 years, then yes, go work with logical qubits, build your algorithms, and we'll talk to you in 10 years. But let's say if some experimental physicist has a device today and they're saying we can do this. And in that case, if you want to get something out from that device, you'll have to work with them and work according to what they provide you and not have your own abstraction layer defined, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, even then you will be working with abstraction because there's no way the people who laid out the circuit specified for how long each pulse should be generated for and how the control electronics should be. Eventually, they also work with abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But actually, one piece of research that kind of also is, I think, breaks this barrier of different abstractions is adapt VQE, and especially there was this second iteration. I don't know if you've seen that by, I think, Sophie Economos group. So basically what they did was first they used genetic algorithm in the first iteration. They used genetic algorithm to design the structure of the ansatz, but in the second iteration, I think it was qBit adapts VQE or something like that. They actually used genetic algorithms to design pulses for this specific ansatz. So they were already kind of influencing, this kind of the circuit on the pulse level, just throwing away the gate kind of abstraction. Totally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another, I think, point with abstraction, it comes from sort of bottom up, which makes the most sense. Only when experimentalists are ready and say, okay, this thing is robust enough that if you just tell us to do this operation, let's call it X, and then we can do it with 99.9999% fidelity. At that point, you can go, okay, this is the layer where I want to stop because it gives me enough enough fidelity that I don't have to worry about the underlying stuff. Whereas if you just say, hey, I want this Y to be done with 99.999 fidelity, then you'll have to wait until they actually do it, right? And that may or may not happen.
Let's get to two last questions I have for you, which one is, have you recently read any good books that you would like to recommend?
Unfortunately, no. I can recommend docs of various quantum software packages or maybe classical software packages.
So which docs that you read recently you would recommend most?
Let's see. Just yesterday I was reading docs for Mongoose.
Okay.
And it's a package for accessing MongoDB.
Okay.
So they were okay. On the software side, Penny Lane's docs have been getting very good. So definitely would recommend that. Qiskit textbook is also getting good. Another good resource that I can recommend. Then there was one more package that came out recently. I think those are the two ones I'd like to recommend.
Okay.
Even Brocket docs are kind of nice. If you're an AWS user, you would really like the fact that it's very nicely packaged into the same AWS docs that you're familiar with. So, yeah, those are nice as well.
Okay, cool. Then I'll definitely go check out the docs you recommended. And the last question is, if someone would like to learn more about you and your work, what's the best place to find you in the internet?
My email, for sure. Look for Papers on Archive. I am contributing to one or two more papers. So we should be coming out with stuff on VQE. So we had an intern working on just VQE problem where actually we worked on a project with MathWorks. We wanted to see the performance of optimizers present in MATLAB for VQEs. And we did that, so there were some exciting results that should be available hopefully in the next 6 months. Follow us on LinkedIn, qBraid. Just search for qBraid on LinkedIn. It should come up. Or if you want to have a small chat or something, you can write to me on first name, last name at qbraid.com.
Sure. We'll put all that into the podcast notes, so that will be easy to find. Okay. Then, great. Thank you very much for the conversation. And I wish you a great day.
You as well. Thank you so much for having me.